Aloha, guys. So just a brief introduction. My name is Fern Ānuenue Holland. I'm from Kauaʻi. I graduated high school and I moved to Australia, where I went to college for 7 years. I graduated with a Bachelor's of Science, triple major in marine biology, wildlife management, and environmental sciences. And then I moved home about 12 years ago. I currently work for Hawaii Alliance for Progressive Action, or HAPA, as a part-time, I'm the Pesticide and Public Health Program Director, and I do environmental consulting work. I'm also the most recent elected County Council member on Kauaʻi, so I'm now an elected official as well. Yay. Please, no, it's torture, but no. So I wear quite a few hats, but I've worked on pesticide stuff mostly over the last 18 years. So I refreshed a little bit on the fertilizer stuff. Most of my background historically has been more pesticides over the last decade or so. But I'm going to be talking a little bit about synthetic inputs and sustainable land care. So first of all, I'm just going to give an introduction. So a little bit of what we're talking about here. Fertilizers. Fertilizers are often mislabeled as plant food, and in actuality, they're not plant food. They're a catalyst that makes plants grow, but it's synthetic, meaning it's kind of fake. It's concentrated doses of core nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, sometimes potassium, and it's very effective in the short term to create a stimulant and a catalyst of growth, but the long-term health of the plant kind of is part of the impact, is the long-term health for short-term success. So, and then pesticides, when I mention pesticides today, I'm going to be mostly talking about fertilizers, but we're talking about herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, all the different types of sides. Side in Latin means death. So basically the death of herbs, fungus, insects, whatever it is. Neonicotinoids, being one of the largest currently used insecticides globally, is the new form of pesticides, which are systemic. So they cycle throughout the entire life of a plant, which is kind of an amazing technology. When you think about it, they're able to put these neonics either around the coating of a seed or surrounding the roots of a plant, and it takes up into the plant, and then it cycles through every bit of the plant. So all the different leaves, flowers, everything shows neonicotinoids. There's also two different types of pesticides, general use and restricted use. General use are the kind that you guys would most likely be able to use, the kind that you can purchase over the counter, where restricted use are ones that you really need a certification. You have to purchase them through a chemical dealer. They're a bit harder to get and restricted for good reason. Now, these synthetic inputs are detrimental to coral reef systems around the world. There's actually a lot of research that comes out of Australia, where I went to school, about the impacts of large ag running off into the reef. Nutrient-rich runoff that has elevated levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, running off into the coastal system has a lot of different impacts, just because of the nutrients itself and changing the chemistry of the water. And then there's also erosion and sedimentation, where you see soil washed out and smothering reefs. These things weaken coral populations, and then their immunity and disease moves in. So what we see after that is that biodiversity is lost. So you can lose different varieties of species. You can see less diversity in what the ecosystem looks like. And that can have impacts that really extend throughout the entire food web. And then we lose environmental services as well. So what is the value of a healthy reef? It's kind of hard to quantify those kind of things, especially into values of dollar values. But having healthy reef populations and fish stocks, having quality water that's not contaminated with different things, and there's just so many different environmental services that having a healthy reef really has on our lives. And then we'll also see that with pesticides, particularly certain pesticides, they'll bioaccumulate or build up in coastal systems. So little fish will have a little bit, and the bigger fish will have more and more, and that's what we see with stuff like mercury as well. So some of the impacts that we see from synthetic fertilizers are deaths to zooxanthellae. So zooxanthellae are the tiny little algae that are present inside of a coral polyp. So this is just one coral polyp, and it's a pretty incredible thing. Zooxanthellae have almost a symbiotic relationship with coral. They live within this outer membrane of the coral polyp, and they produce and synthesize sunlight into energy. And then the coral actually uses some of that energy for its life and its growth. And if you see a bleaching incident where the coral's gone white, that's when all the zooxanthellae has kind of been killed and left the coral, and coral often dies without it. So this incredible partnership between these microalgae single-celled organisms and coral polyps is pretty cool, and we see that majorly impacted by synthetic runoff. We also see endocrine disruption, and endocrine is basically your hormone system. So you can see the plants or the animals and the algae just totally change because of the impacts to the endocrine. And then reproductive problems. So you can see, especially with pesticides, we'll see all kinds of reproductive problems to particularly larvae. We're seeing more and more in the research that neonicotinoids, systemic pesticides, which are very commonly associated now with pollinator deaths and the death to bees and insects, are also decimating larvae in their beginning stages, especially. And so that you can see so many impacts to an entire reef system by runoff that kills the larvae. And then you'll also see neurotoxicity and die-offs of different species. So one of the most common things that people talk about when they talk about a heavy nutrient runoff or synthetic fertilizers that are not really staying in the soil but running off in the rain and ending up in the water is you'll see eutrophication. And eutrophication is basically an over-enrichment of the water where there's too much fertilizer, too much nutrient in the system, and it fuels this rapid algae growth. And so oftentimes you'll see that resembled in this green color that is often a telltale sign that something's going through eutrophication. And what happens is the algae then boom into this population, they fill the system, they deplete all the oxygen, and when they die and decompose. And so then the system becomes anaerobic. And this can create entire dead zones where life no longer can live, and that you'll see fish die-offs and things like that. So you see algae overgrowth. Again, that's due to the excess nitrogen, phosphorus. It feeds that macroalgae and it creates harmful algae blooms, and that can actually smother the coral reefs so that they can't get the sunlight, so those zooxanthellae can't create energy. By smothering, you can also see algae blooms that create toxic byproducts that actually kill because they're producing secondary toxic compounds. And you'll see coral bleaching, imbalances within the coral due to resilience to temperature stress and disease and all that stuff. It just becomes, it's basically like when your immune system is weakened, you're more susceptible to all the things that can make us sicker. And then we see those disruptions of the marine food web and the collapse of coral reef ecosystems. We also see groundwater contamination with fertilizer. It's a common situation where nitrates will leach into either drinking water sources or groundwater, and they pose all kinds of health threats to humans, but also to the environment. And certain things like pesticides like atrazine are really known to contaminate groundwater. And what happens is, and you can see in the little graphic there that I got off the internet, the fertilizers and pesticides end up like seeping into the groundwater through oftentimes like long-term percolation. There's also a lot of other impacts to fertilizers that I didn't want to go too into because we're kind of zoomed in this course to looking at, well, how are we affecting the immediate offshore reefs and coral systems? But really, the production of fertilizers has a lot of global impact as well. So there's a widespread impact to fertilizers, much of which comes from agriculture. Right here, 67% of the nitrous oxide that's produced globally expected to have come from agricultural sources. So we see air pollution and climate impacts. Nitrous oxide I just mentioned, but also the production of CO2s in the making of these kind of synthetic fertilizers produce all kinds of other global climate change impacts that really affect coral reefs as well, right? So it's all kind of tied back to the global thing impacts us here locally as well. There's also global inequality and environmental justice. And so you kind of see a lot of these mining operations for these nutrients and these processing facilities that produce byproducts are often happen in low socioeconomic demographics, places where people are, more impoverished or in some way generally in minority communities, like basically. And that can lead to all kinds of human health impacts as well, right? And then we have toxic chemicals and the worker hazards, the actual like workers that are in these plants that are making these fertilizers. There's also impacts there. There's also soil impact. So obviously we've talked a little bit already today about how important the soil is and the health of the soil, losing those microorganisms, creating soil acidification, salinity, reducing the fertility of soils, and then becoming dependent because we break those natural nutrient cycles that are so important for the natural functioning of the planet. And so you see that on a local level and on a global level with the massive amounts of synthetic inputs that are used largely in agriculture and landscaping. And then mining, so the actual impact of the mining is also horrific in some places. This is a phosphorus mine. I forget where exactly this is, but this is a phosphorus mine leading to habitat destruction, more soil erosion, disruption to water tables, and obviously there's a huge amount of energy use and pollution that comes into mining as well, and the water contamination from industrial waste. So we also see the waste and the runoff being, acidic effluent leaving mining sites, and phosphate fertilizer production also results in radioactive materials. And so I just kind of wanted to touch on that, even though it's not the focus of our offshore immediate reef, it is a global issue. And so some of the alternative options, again, we've already heard people talking today about how we feed and take care and build up our soil. And I think that's the key thing here, and every situation is different. But thinking about it in a way of instead of feeding the plant, you're feeding the soil is kind of the mindset of this. And so rather than feeding the plant some nitrogen, phosphorus, you're kind of feeding it into the soil in a natural form, so it's bioavailable for the plants. And so this is basically increasing the recycling nutrients that are naturally existing on the planet, naturally existing in soil, and the cycling of them, reducing the fertilizer input needs, and then building up the life of the soil. Like the previous speakers talked about, microbes, obviously, and building the strength of the nutrient cycles inside the soil so that you don't have to add anything to it. It's kind of doing it on its own. The importance of active soil biology cannot be overstated. And I think previous testimony or previous speakers have talked about how important it is, and I just can't emphasize it enough. The life of the soil, the biology, the stuff that all the synthetics kill are actually the things that make the soil the best for us to be able to have the best landscaping and healthy soils and plants. And so having that nutrient availability is also, the nutrient availability and the soil temperature are related. And so here we have pretty great year-round conditions where the temperatures really allow for nutrient availability. In some places where it gets really cold, you see that reduced, but we have pretty good temperatures for these kind of things. And another thing is insulating the soil, and so mulch, and we'll talk a little bit about some of these options, but insulating the soil also helps to retain that moisture. And so the biology, the moisture, and the nutrients all connected in how we feed the soil rather than feeding our plants. So there's been a lot of calls for sustainable alternatives to the traditional synthetic fertilizers that are common. And these things obviously protect our ecosystems, they restore that soil health, and build resilience. So the stronger our systems are, the more robust and resilient they are, the better we can deal with one-off incidences, storms, and impact. So nourishing plants while protecting soil, water, and marine life is really one of the main reasons that we call for these sustainable alternatives, because thinking about the health of the system holistically as one large place and not one thing like this plant, but zooming out and looking at the whole system, really creating that connection between soil, water, and biology. Reducing runoff, supporting local ecosystems, also then in turn builds those environmental services. So like I mentioned briefly with the picture of the runoff in Waimea, the environmental services in the natural world, everything from clean air because of a forest, or rain that is developed because of upland ohia forests that then produce rain for us. All of these things are services that the environment provides. These ecosystem or environmental services range from, clean air and water to the fundamentals of fishing grounds, access to resources, all of these different things that play into the services that the environment provides for us. And it's really hard to calculate the costs and the value of such a thing like that. Like, how do you value clean water? How do you value clean air? And in my environmental science degree, we did talk about ways that people try to do that, because there's a value to how much it would cost to filter that out of the air. There's a cost involved in that. How much would it cost you to clean that water that's poisoned if you had to pay for a filter? And instead you invest in the land, you invest in the soil so it filters those things, and that's a cost saved, right? If you think about the external costs of what these environmental services provide for us. So one of the really commonly used alternatives to synthetic fertilizers is compost. So compost is basically just decomposed organic matter. So you'll hear about like black gold and these rich compost options that are usually made from, well broken down food scraps, leaves, nutrients, sometimes manure, that's really broken down, and you get a wider swath of nutrients that are available and biologically available so that they can feed those microbes that we talk about that are all part of that system and improve the structure of the soil so that they slowly release those nutrients to plants rather than boosting them with a synthetic high dose and then kind of fizzling away or having impacts that then weaken the plant later. It creates like a dependence. But in this case, you have compost that slowly releases those nutrients. It's also free. It's usually free, so that's definitely a benefit. And it's safe because there's not synthetic chemicals, it stays in the soil, and it reduces the waste that we have as well. So it's also a holistic way to think about how do we reduce the solid waste that we're producing as well. Another great option to subsidize for synthetic fertilizers would be some sort of cover crop or green manure. So these are often nitrogen fixing plants, so plants that produce nitrogen in the soil, usually legumes or clover, things that are known to fix nitrogen and make it more biologically available in the soil. These also prevent erosion, which builds healthier soil as well, because your soil is not running off into the ocean. Obviously, that's retaining our topsoil and preventing loss, which means that we have richer soils to work with and we're not sedimenting that onto the reef. So adding organic matter to the soil makes it richer. It also helps to suppress weeds. So if you're using the right cover crops, you're feeding the soil and you're also suppressing weed growth. So that can be a double benefit there. And it also keeps nutrients in the ground and reduces that runoff, which is why it's safe for reef systems. Mulch, leaf, mold, grass, clippings, these kind of things are essential in especially in agriculture, especially in permaculture and small farming efforts. They're critical around trees. You can see such a difference in a tree that might be struggling because of not having mulch and being just soil exposed to the sun, exposed to the elements, and then you add that mulch and it insulates the soil like we talked about. It keeps that moisture in the soil. It suppresses the weeds that will compete for the nutrients, and it also breaks down and decomposes into compost. So mulch will slowly become more and more bioavailable food for plants. So this prevents soil erosion. It reduces the need for fertilizers because the soils become so rich. And it plays into the positive reinforcing circle of not needing synthetic inputs. So a critical part of both agriculture and landscaping is using mulch. And you can be really creative with mulch. Certain types of mulch will actually resist certain pests. So camphor, eucalyptus, certain crops that might have secondary compounds that scare away some bugs might actually work to the benefit of multiple things. So you're not just saving the soil and enriching the life of the soil, but then also preventing the need for pesticides and really feeding into the health of the whole system. And I know you've already learned about biochar, so I included that one in here, but Don't have to go into it too much. Just, like you guys already know, it's kind of a charcoal substance made by heating the plant material. And then that stores carbon, holds nutrients, improves soil drainage and fertility, and it locks the nutrients in the soil. So not only does it keep it biologically available for plants, but it keeps it there, and then it doesn't leach into waterways. So another benefit of biochar. And we've already heard a little bit about fungi today. Mycorrhizal fungi and beneficial microbes actually have oftentimes symbiotic relationships. The previous speaker talked about this as well. The bacteria and the fungi working together really help plants absorb nutrients and absorb water. And yeah, like the previous speaker was talking about, there's so many benefits to mushrooms, so many different benefits to these types of fungi, both for pest control, and actually the only known possible biological control for coconut rhinoceros beetle is also a fungi in the soil, and that fungi goes after the larvae stages. And you can inoculate compost and inoculate soil where they will breed, and they will actually die because the larvae will not be able to pupate and develop into beetles. So there's pest control benefits of fungi, and obviously huge soil. They're nutrient rich. They have all kinds of relationships with nutrients in the soil that helps plants, and they can increase the nutrient efficiency. You again will reduce your need for fertilizers. It will also improve overall plant health, which is great. They are safe. Most of them are naturally occurring. Sometimes you can kind of feed them into a system and add them in, but many of them already exist. And once you have the pH in the soil good, and once you're not putting synthetic inputs in that are killing a lot of these, you can actually see the natural system balance out, and fungi play a very key role in fertilizing your soil. And there's no chemical runoff from them. They continue to enhance the soil life. Another one is compost teas and plant-based fertilizers. So these are liquid extracts that are made from compost. So it can be like high concentrated compost tea that you can actually purchase. Sometimes it's made out of stuff like kelp or seaweed, molasses, even nettle. Depending on what you're using, they can have different benefits. And so you can have different types of benefits depending on what you're looking for. Certain teas will have more of a certain nutrient that you might be trying to substitute. And they provide micronutrients as well as the macronutrients. So instead of just going after the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium that are more common in synthetic, you'll have a wide range of nutrients like boron, like the previous speaker was speaking of, and all kinds of other things. So you have like a more holistic fertilizer kind of ingredient in your soil, instead of just the bulk nutrient macro nutrients pumped into the system at high amounts. And so this is, yeah, they're easy to apply. You can kind of do it like almost watering. Very common because they're strong, and you don't have to lay the compost. You can just use it like water. And gentle on the soil and water systems, and generally very biodegradable. So this is another great alternative to synthetic fertilizers. Manure is another one. So manure can be all kinds of manure. It's not just chicken. I use this chicken picture because I found it online. I thought it was cute. I have chickens that run around my backyard. They naturally provide me with manure. A lot of times you'll see horse manure is used, cow manure is regularly used. Depending on what it is, it's basically animal waste of some kind that's been aged or composted to eliminate the pathogens and a lot of the smell. So true manure that you would use is aged and slightly composted. It's not just like fresh out of the butt of the chicken, like my yard. Benefits are that they're very rich in nitrogen and organic matter. So it's a great opportunity to utilize a natural source of a lot of these nutrients. And when it's properly managed, it releases nutrients slowly. So again, the key with a lot of these substitutes is slow release. And you'll actually see synthetic fertilizers try to mimic that, and they'll sell like slow release fertilizer because that's what the natural world actually wants, is slow release fertilizer. So it's a really another great alternative to pumping the system with synthetics, and it also helps to build our soil. So all of these things are better for coastal systems and island communities. And this is a photo of a bleached reef system, so you can really see the before and after of this area. No runoff from this means no reef damage. So if your shoreline, if your front lawn is not running off into the water, there's not runoff happening off that grass like the previous speaker spoke to, but it's getting filtered through things. For whatever reason you don't have runoff, then you're not damaging the reef. It's the runoff that's coming off the shore, off the grass, off the fields, that runs into the reef and damages our reefs. So the key is, like, how do we stop that runoff entirely, really? How do we improve the soil and reduce these erosion, which is great for land and water, because we want our soil on the land, not in the water. The lower long-term costs for maintenance of things, because you're reducing that fertilizer dependence. So eventually you're not going to have to buy these synthetic fertilizers, because the system will be so good and so healthy without it that you really won't need to be spending all that money on reducing or constantly purchasing fertilizer. So you're reducing your cost and your dependency. You can also support local and keep a closed loop system. So all of these things can be done entirely on Maui. You don't need anything, you don't have to bring in anything, you're not mining anything from somewhere out across the world and depending on Young Brothers with their 45% increase of shipping to get it here, and all of those things. And so as things become more costly and harder to get, here we have a closed loop system where we can support local sources of these compost and nutrients, and we can do it in-house. So that's great. Basically, healthy soil equals healthy reefs. And the healthier your soil is, the healthier the offshore reef is. The sustainable fertilizers don't just feed, it's like truly sustainable fertilizers, back to that first slide, aren't just feeding a plant. You know, they restore an ecosystem. They rebuild an ecosystem from the ground up. And by switching from those synthetic inputs to those natural solutions, coastal communities can protect the reef, we can protect our fisheries, and the waters that sustain them. And with that, we have a more abundance of food sources, we have tourism, values of reefs that people actually want to see instead of coming here and be like, oh, why is the reef dead? You know, you have so many benefits that we can actually relate right back to a monetary value, like food and business and tourism, and then all the other things that come with a healthy reef system, the culture, the diversity, and all the greatness that comes with having a diverse reef system that's healthy. So healthy soils basically equals healthy reefs. So I went through that way faster than I was expecting. These are my last few slides. So sustainable fertilization practices for coastal landscapes. So talked a little bit about what the issues are, what is synthetic, fertilizers, and then what are the options and all those alternatives, and just kind of circling into some of those practices for coastal landscapes. Really, in addition to building up the health of your soil and focusing on building up and providing natural sources that aren't toxic to the natural world, whether it's pesticides or synthetic fertilizers, by avoiding synthetic inputs altogether, you really start to move away from those impacts in a way that's very meaningful. You no longer have to worry about the purchasing and the bringing in, the importing of these synthetics, but you also prevent that toxic runoff. And you can really see in this image, this satellite image of the plumes running off the land, in a truly protected system and a functioned, intact ecosystem. There should be a million different types of plants and a whole protected ecosystem that buffers all of that, and none of that would be running off into the ocean. You wouldn't see these giant plumes of sediment and soil and the nutrients that comes with agriculture running off into our waters. And this is a great example, similar to that first slide that I used from Waimea, where you can see on the west Kauaʻi the runoff from Waimea River, which does the same thing, but this is like such a larger view of a zoomed out satellite image where you can just see how much sediment there is and how far out into the deep sea these things impact. And it's not just the coral reefs, it's layers out into the pelagic ocean as sediment moves and alters the chemistry of our water. Our water chemistry is such an important balance, and it's just like our atmosphere. It just takes a few things to change, and a significant, disconnect between one thing that used to not be very high, and then you see like whatever it is, or the turbidity making the water not allow sunlight through. There's so many things that the chemical equation of what pure water and clear water looks like, and it can so easily be disrupted. So preventing runoff by avoiding those synthetic chemicals, you already know that if you do have runoff, your runoff isn't going to have those synthetic chemicals. So you've already brought it down a notch. If you apply your natural fertilizers during drier weather, you're obviously going to reduce your runoff chances. You're not going to have runoff as regularly because it's dry, so it's not raining. So that's another tactic for keeping the nutrient on land and not ending up in the water. You can use those slow release, those organic formulations. Again, like I mentioned, synthetic fertilizers try to mimic that slow release, but the reality is that by using the truly organic, non-synthetic inputs, you really do have naturally slow release fertilizer. So sticking with organic helps with preventing the runoff. Obviously, where you're fertilizing is also important. So avoiding storm drains, avoiding canals, high sloped areas where you're going to see faster runoff. All of these things help to prevent runoff into our marine ecosystems. Another great technique for reducing, impact to offshore waters of, either large garden systems or agricultural systems or big landscaped lawns, etc., is to filter it before it reaches the ocean. And again, I keep saying testifiers because I'm so used to that, but previous speakers have talked about the importance of this already, and native plants and utilizing those native buffer zones really. And this helps with all kinds of things. I mean, buffer zones and rain gardens are used throughout the world to protect wetland systems from runoff. So you can actually, like, say that table over there is a wetland that we want to protect, and this is our property. Well, we could turn a whole section of land in between into an additional, like, basically manufactured wetland that's then a buffer for the actual wetland. So you kind of almost keep the same species of wetland plants coming toward wherever the runoff could be coming from. So it acts as a buffer zone, and it actually catches those rain gardens, catch the flow of water. They start to suck up the nutrients before it even gets to the actual wetland that we're trying to maybe buffer. This also can work with pesticides. We've seen buffer zones protecting different habitat, different, I hesitate to say communities because it only works so well. But buffer zones definitely add a layer of protection, particularly for runoff into systems. Using, like the previous speakers have also talked about, native and deep-rooted plants really help with maximum uptake. Being selective about what you're using, that they're tolerant, like the previous speaker spoke of. Obviously, the more that we can use natives, the better. They're also more adapted to Hawaii, and this ecosystem can also help to pull these things out of the system, buffer the waterways, and filter nutrients. Another major thing, which is kind of where the bulk of my work has been over the last decade, is around policy and education. And so, banning high nitrogen or phosphorus fertilizers is something that we've seen communities do across the world. That could be because we're in a sensitive marine environment or a small island ecosystem, or near an aquatic system like a protected waterway. But we see communities take pretty strong stances on banning some of these high nitrogen phosphorus fertilizers that will end up in waterways to try to preempt these impacts. And then you see Reef safe certification programs for landscapers, stuff like that happens around the world. So different programs will, and like we've talked about, these kind of programs of certification, they provide you, they're a selling point for tourism, they are a marketing, part of it all. They help to be good stewards of the land and the oceans, and feed back into a healthier Maui in this case, or wherever we are, it feeds into a healthier system. And then public awareness campaigns are great. So oftentimes stuff like don't feed the algae headlines. You know, I remember when I spent some time in Kentucky, the billboards were something I just I couldn't get used to these giant billboards on the highway. It was mind-blowing to me that they let them have these huge signs that look like buildings on the side of the road. But one of the things really surprised me, because I'd never lived away from the ocean, was that they had these giant billboards that had like Little Mermaid scenes on them. And they said, all rivers flow to the sea. And I kept thinking, where do people think they go? I was so confused. I was like, this is so weird. Everywhere you go along the highway, it tells you that the rivers go to the sea. And I'm thinking, that's so weird. And then so I asked my friend that I was with, I said, why all the Little Mermaid stuff, you know? And it's because we're 9 hours from the ocean, and a lot of people had never seen the ocean. And they have this thing in Kentucky where when the rains come, they go down to the river and they put their leftover oil and their leftover gas and the pesticide jugs that they never could get rid of. It's like, oh honey, a storm's coming. Well, let's go put that stuff down by the river. And so they would literally do that. And so they had to turn it into an educational campaign across Kentucky to teach people that what you put by the river, it's going to go out to the ocean eventually, even if it's 9 hours drive away. At some point, it's going to reach the ocean, right? And so here that's amplified because our ocean is right there. But it happens everywhere. So people inland, you know, in these places. So sometimes there's like catchphrases. I know I'm half Australian, and we get these crazy like catchphrases in Australia, like don't be a tosser, put your trash in the bin. So a tosser is like an Australian insult word, and like don't be an idiot, don't be a tosser, they'll say. And so the along the highway it says don't be a tosser, put your trash in the bin, because they're trying to like limit like litter, right? So stuff like this, public awareness campaigns, educational campaigns, catchphrases and stuff like that can help to start to teach people about the real importance of all of these things, and of reef safe programs and land management and agriculture and all these things. And then pesticide regulations and limitations. And so historically over the last few years, that's where my work has been. For the last 18 years, I have been one of the largest activists in the United States around pesticide stuff. I work in a small global circle and a national circle of people that are trying to push back on these unregulated pesticide producers. That's a lot of my work. We've been fighting for buffer zones around schools. We've been fighting for neonicotinoids to be registered as restricted or banned in Hawaii. 11 states have already banned the use of neonics across the United States because of the massive impact that we're finding to pollinators. And now over the last decade, we've realized that there's this huge impact to aquatic larvae and coral reef systems, of which we're surrounded by. So Hawaii seems like a perfectly good place to ban neonics as well, with of course certain exceptions where we need them. And limitations to these just wide swath dependency that we have on pesticides. So a lot of the policy and educational work that I've done is more based around these pesticide regulations and work. It'll be 18 years, actually it was 18 years last week that I've been fighting chemical corporations. What a joy. And that's a perfect time to clap because I'm done. That's me.